Well, I figured it out, and it might be kind of disappointing.
Oh. I'm just excited to hear any information about it, right? So I keep looking every once in a while and to see if someone wrote something about it. But
hello and welcome to Season 3 of the Sub Pop Podcast.
Episode 1.
Yeah. I am Arwen Nix and I am here with Alyssa Atkins.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good. It's good to see you.
It's nice to see you too.
Me?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, we sit like one desk away from each other. We see each other a lot.
Tony in the middle.
But it's still nice, yeah. Tony cool? Okay. So last season we got an email from a listener.
We did.
We did.
We asked for one and we literally got one.
We got one. We got a couple.
Oh,
but we
good.
got this one and we decided to start the season off by answering his question.
Okay, are you there?
yeah.
Okay, great. How's it going? How's your day?
Oh, it's pretty
So
good.
this is
Got a day
Devin
off,
Shields. And Devin wrote in and asked us what the deal was with something he called the Sub Pop invasion of Halifax that happened in the mid-90s. And what he means is that why and how did Sub Pop end up signing 3 bands from Halifax, Nova Scotia, more like almost 4,000 miles away from where we are in the mid-90s? Why did that happen?
Why do you care about the Sub Pop invasion of Halifax? Like, what got you curious about it?
Well, I grew up in Halifax, and but it's like when Sub Pop came through, I was only about 11 years old, and then like growing up, you'd hear people talking about it a little bit, but there wasn't a lot of people that would go into detail about it, and there's
What would they say when you heard people talking?
no, people would just like talk about the excitement of like all these bands getting signed up, and 'cause Halifax is kind of a isolated scene. There's not a lot of record labels that go through and pick up bands.
So this was a good question from Devin. The bands he's actually talking about, specifically Eric's Trip, Jail, Hardship Post, and some spin-offs and solo records, a comp called Never Mind the Mollusks.
Never mind the mollusks.
That's what he's referring to in this Halifax invasion. What was the other name we had for it?
The New Brunswick Connection.
Yes, I really
Yeah.
liked that.
I know, it feels like a spy movie.
It
with like a
does.
Mini Cooper in it or something.
Absolutely. I didn't actually know the answer to this question.
You didn't know the
Can
answer?
you believe it? It's so shocking. Devin, you stumped me. I didn't know the true root of the answer to it, but we asked Chris and Jonathan, and you started asking around more, and we kept getting the same answer, right?
Yes, all roads pointed to Boston.
All roads point to Boston
Yeah.
for the answer.
Yeah. So just real quick, Halifax, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, that's Canada.
That's Canada, people.
That's the east coast of Canada. But all roads for the answer, or at least the holder of the answer, pointed to Boston.
Intriguing.
Mm-hmm. The reason they did is because apparently there's a woman named Joyce Linehan. She exists. She's the former head of A&R for Sub Pop, and she lives in Boston. And when I asked Chris, like, who is our boss, what's the deal with the New Brunswick connection? What's the deal with the Sub Pop invasion of Halifax? He was like, oh, that's Joyce. You have to talk to Joyce. And he kept talking about Joyce and how she got in politics after she worked at Sub Pop and how she worked with the mayor of Boston now and this thing that happened with Elizabeth Warren and how she had this house where she like widened her driveway so more vans could fit in the driveway for when touring bands stayed with her, and like some sort of cage that was made to protect vans. And like
Right after he mentions Elizabeth Warren, he's like, and then there was a cage.
And then there was a cage for vans. And I was like, wait, Elizabeth Warren? What does Elizabeth Warren have to do with the Sub Pop invasion of Halifax? And who is this Joyce Linehan woman?
And why is she building cages for vans? All of
Yeah.
it. Fascinating.
So,
Intriguing, I'll say.
since I was intrigued, and with the permission of Chris,
Permission of Chris. I like that.
I headed to Boston.
The destination of this train is Pass Mine.
To interview Joyce Linehan in her living room, where I had coffee and I met her dog. What's your dog's name?
Her name is Mercy, as in no mercy.
So I had Devin's questions to start.
How did Sub Pop come here to hear about the Halifax music scene, and what about it enticed Sub Pop to go there?
There's a radio station here, still here, called WMBR, which is MIT radio station, and they were playing a single by a band called Sloan, and I really liked it, and heard that they were from Nova Scotia, and just happened to be going to Nova Scotia for a family reunion because that's where my mother's from. So I called their manager, and not unbeknownst to me, they were already pretty far along on a record deal, but I just wanted to see what was happening with them. So talked to their manager, and he said, we're having this big show up in Halifax, the weekend that you're here. Can you come? So I went up and I saw Eric's Trip, which is a band from New Brunswick, who was being managed by the gentleman who was managing Sloan at the time. A band called Tag that ended up being Jail, that ended up being a Sub Pop band as well. And I think the Hardship Post, I think they might have played that weekend. If they didn't, I certainly encountered them not long after that on some trip to the Maritimes. But I spent a lot of time in the Maritimes when I was at Sub Pop.
So when people say, what's the deal with Sub Pop's invasion of Halifax?
It's that my mother was born in Nova Scotia. So I could make up a better story.
So all of the bands that are considered part of this Halifax Connection, New Brunswick Connection for the Sub Pop lore, all come down to one fateful weekend where Joyce visits a family reunion, visits her mom.
Yeah, there's a family reunion because her mom is from there. So that's why the family reunion is there. And there happened to be some shows
That Joyce went to.
And Eric's Trip, Jail, and the Hardship Post all played that weekend. So that's how those relationships were formed.
Wow.
And then when Joyce becomes the head of A&R, or maybe she's the head of A&R at that point, like the dates are kind of muddied there. We thus have the Sub Pop invasion of Halifax. And like there are a few articles written about this. There are a few Canadian music writers, and I was able to find, I'm sure that there's more than a few Canadian music writers, but there are a few music writers in Canada who wrote about the Sub Pop invasion of Halifax or the New Brunswick Connection. And the thing is, it's all just questions. Like, there aren't really any answers to any of the questions. And the questions posed are like, is Halifax the next Seattle? And I'm not sure what people mean, but I think it's because you had the grunge explosion in Seattle at that point.
Right.
And it's just like everyone thinking that maybe this small town, basically, this small place in Canada, is going to be like the next big thing when it comes to the worldwide music scene. And it wasn't. No fault of the bands.
Right.
No fault of the bands. But there was no one brought out any charts or maps and said like, okay, where's the next Seattle? Oh, I know. Halifax.
So I like how you posed to Devin, you might be disappointed, or even Joyce saying, I could make up a better answer, but
Yeah.
this is basically why. But there's still so much more about Joyce as this person that even would at a family reunion have this, okay, I'm going to this show and now I see all this potential. There's like so much more about her that I want to know.
Yeah, she's fascinating. I became mildly obsessed with her when Chris
In
told
a
me about
friendly
her
way.
in a friendly, non-creepy way. I mean, I did try and find her unpublished thesis that she wrote in college, but just because she seems so interesting. Like, there's so much about her work in politics and her transition from music and how music and politics kind of collide in like the ethos of her life that kind of took her on the rest of her course.
Well, and in your reading, didn't you find an article about her that was called The Decider?
Result 2, when you Google Joyce Linehan, like the first one is her bio for boston.gov, and the second is this profile of her in this Boston magazine, and the title is The Decider. Yeah, there's a lot about this woman.
So how did you go from going to shows to working with bands?
I don't really know. I mean, I think it was one of those things where, the bands kind of looked around and said, oh, you might be good at management.
So she's a teenager, and these bands are like, hey, you seem like you'd be a good manager. And she starts managing bands like Plan 9 and the Smithereens. And then she starts working at clubs and booking shows.
You know, was just kind of always involved in the music scene, making money, doing other things.
And eventually her path crosses with Sub Pop.
When I really became aware of Sub Pop was in, you know, the early 90s. So, you know, Tom Johnston is a Boston guy who we met when we were 5 years old and grew up to do shows together, to work at the Rat and a bunch of other places here. We were doing shows, and he was actually more the connection. So he was, there were a couple of booking agents from other parts of the country who worked with bands who were Sub Pop affiliated, and we started doing shows with some of them. So we did shows with, you know, Tad and Mudhoney and a lot of the early Sub Pop bands at different clubs. We lost a lot of money on Sub Pop bands in the early days. But that's okay, it was worth it.
So then how did you end up working with Sub Pop?
I was managing a band called Six Finger Satellite, which Jonathan was very enamored of. And we were working together on negotiating a record deal for them. And I don't really remember how it came to pass that I was offered a job, but I do remember sort of a magical trip to Vermont with Bruce and Jonathan to Montpelier, where somehow, I don't know what was going on, but somehow we started talking about how it would be great for Sub Pop to have an East Coast presence, and Vermont was great, and, you know, all these kinds of things. And then eventually I ended up being offered a job as a retail promotions person for Sub Pop.
And then you went from retail to working A&R?
Yep, I did. I'm not sure how quickly that happened, but it definitely happened. I mean, I was the only one on the East Coast, so it was sort of easy to assign me, you know, some work with groups that were here, you know, just for proximity's sake.
And you worked at Sub Pop for about 6 years.
I think it was, I want to say it was 92 to 98. Yeah, oh, that's 6, yeah. I see it as long, I sort of assumed it was longer than that, but okay, yep.
So what are some of the bands that you brought to the label?
Well, my first one was Velocity Girl, so that was fun. They were supposed to be huge.
I can't stop smiling, and I don't know why I want to anyway.
Okay, so by day, her house is the East Coast office of Sub Pop. It's all business, and by night, all the bands that played in Boston on tour, or many of them at least, would stay at her house. Her house has this kind of storied reputation.
Yeah, about half of that stuff is true. Yeah, it's a house that I bought in 1992, I think, 91 or 92, so shortly after or during the time that I was starting with Sub Pop. And yeah, everybody stayed there. It was a gathering place. There were, you know, apparently songs written there that went on to be pretty successful. I read about that 15 years after it happened.
I am doll eyes, doll mouth, doll legs.
She's talking about doll parts. Courtney Love claims to have written doll parts in Joyce's kitchen.
I was asleep at the time, so I had very little to do with it. But yeah, a lot of the bands stayed there. And it wasn't just Sub Pop bands. It was, you know, back then there was this kind of circuit of houses all across the country, and my house was the Boston house.
I heard that you built some sort of pen for people's vans or what have you.
Yeah, it was a necessity. So the neighborhood that I grew up in and still live in is called Dorchester, and like a lot of American cities, it's had its ups and downs in terms of crime. So it was a little bit of a car break-in era that we were going through. So in order to safely park a van and not have to unload it, I built a cage.
So Joyce works with Sub Pop from 1992 to 1998. And when she leaves, she goes on to start her own PR company and put out other records with Joe Pernice and a million other things. And she's successful. She has like a really enviable client list. She's enjoying her life. And then this happens.
CNN now projects, Larry, that Scott Brown will become the next United States Senator from the state of Massachusetts, defeating the Democrat Martha Coakley. Take a look at this.
Okay, so if you're not familiar with Scott Brown, or if you don't remember this race, let me explain it. Scott Brown won a special election for Senator Ted Kennedy's seat after Kennedy passed away. So when Brown won, it had been like almost 60 years of just Democrats in that seat. And then he's a Republican and he wins and people do not like him and Democrats are mad and Joyce does not like him and she is a mad Democrat.
And so here we were with this person who had really no political record. He was a Republican. He was going to undo a lot of the good work that Ted Kennedy had done. And he won a special election, so he was only going to be in the seat for, I think it was less than 2 years. So when it came time to form the Democratic field that would then run for that seat to try to retake it, the field that was forming just didn't really do much of anything for me.
But there was someone that she liked.
My guest tonight, a professor of law at Harvard University Safety School. She's also the chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel on TARP. Please welcome to the show, Elizabeth Warren. Doctor!
I was aware of her mainly because of her appearances on The Daily Show. And here was this, this professor with a background in economics who could explain to somebody like me who isn't an economist how these things work in a way that I could actually understand them. I just really loved her. There were a few of us that sort of started to agitate a little bit to try to get her to consider running. So I guess at some point in like May of that year, I tweeted something like, Elizabeth Warren, if you'll run for the Senate, I will knock on doors until my hands bleed. A couple months later, I got a call at 9:30 on a Sunday morning. I was out walking my dog and somebody called and said, hey, Elizabeth Warren's actually kind of thinking that she might get into the race. Could you put together a house party, bring some people together so she can talk to some folks and make a decision? And I said, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. And I said, when, figuring they were going to say, next month. And he said, tomorrow. So like 18 hours later, there were about 80 people in my living room at the house that I used to live in. And it was the first house party that she had, is what I'm told. And it was magical.
Okay, so early 90s, Courtney Love writes doll parts at Joyce's House. 30 years later, Elizabeth Warren begins her tour of homes as she gears up to launch her Senate campaign at Joyce's House. Different house, but same Joyce. I mean, come on.
I'm going to do this. I'm going to run for the United States Senate. And the reason is straightforward. Middle-class families have been chipped at.
On one of the Senate races that we've been watching tonight, CBS News projects that Elizabeth Warren, the Democrat, will pick up the Senate seat in the state of Massachusetts. We are projecting that...
Continue to think it's one of the best things that my friends and I have ever done in our entire lives.
So at that point, did you have a goal to make a career in politics?
Never. I was always a volunteer, so it was a sideline. I was very active in the neighborhood. I come from a community that gave so much to me growing up. I was, my father died when I was very young, raised by a single mom. She never would have been able to do what she did were the community not supportive of her. There's a culture of volunteerism and a culture of service that exists here that sometimes people who aren't here, I have a hard time explaining it to them. They have a hard time understanding it. So always been active in the neighborhood, was active in, I founded a nonprofit arts group here, the Dorchester Arts Collaborative. My mother ran a halfway house for people who have addiction. A substance use disorder is what we call it now. But she did that, so that that's part of the family culture as well. So service was always on the docket, but always as a volunteer. I had absolutely no intention of ending up where I ended up. I was doing very, very well, and completely ready to carry on in that path, and then I didn't.
Yeah. So what happened?
So a friend of mine, his name is Marty Walsh. He decided to run for mayor of Boston.
It was expected to be a tight race, but in a little less than 2 hours after the polls closed on Tuesday, Boston has a winner. Marty Walsh will be the city's next mayor.
Started out as his press person, and then ended up as his policy director, and then ended up co-chairing his transition team, and then was ready to go back to my former life when he said, no, I need you to come in. So there I am.
So there she is, Joyce Linehan, former head of A&R for Sub Pop from some point in the 90s to 1998. Now the chief of policy for the mayor of Boston, which to me is fucking wild. And I think that Joyce can appreciate like how that seems novel, how you go from like working at a place called The Rat to then being the chief of policy for the mayor of Boston. But it made sense to her, I mean, in a way.
I've always been politically active. My father was actually state representative in Massachusetts. I've been involved in campaigns a lot over the course of my life. I think, and I tell people this, I hope it's true, I think I was politicized by the Reagan-Thatcher years. You know, those were pretty rough times, and I think that there are a lot of people my age who have the same experience and sort of come to political activism through music. Someone asked a friend of mine, actually he's a friend who's written a pretty well-known book called All Souls. I think people know him. His name is Michael Patrick McDonald. Asked him, what qualifications does she have to do the work that she's doing now? And he said, well, that it's community organizing is the same whether you're organizing people to protest or you're organizing people to come to a punk rock show. It's the same skill set.
That's so good.
Yeah, it's the same skill set. Community organizing and getting people to go to a punk rock show. It's the same skill set. I love her. I love Joyce.
So that's the New Brunswick Connection featuring Joyce Linehan.
Yeah. She really has something, I gotta say. And when I asked Jonathan and Megan, like when I talked to each of them about Joyce to see if they were surprised that she ended up as the chief of policy, like helping work on everything from public transit to like housing first to online dog licenses, like
right.
If they were surprised that she ended up working for the mayor of Boston, and both of them were just like, no, like Joyce is a force. She's a force to be reckoned with.
And how lucky for us that we got to know more about her from a question from Devin.
Thanks, Devin.
Thanks, Devin. Thanks, Joyce.
Yeah. And thanks, Devin, for letting me call you.
I know. That was also nice.
Yeah. What a sweetie.
So season 3, we're back.
Yeah, we did it.
So this season we'll be putting out episodes every other week. We've got some really good stuff we're excited about.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not going to talk about it just yet.
I will. Next week is Hardly Art.
Oh, okay. We can talk about that.
We're going to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of Hardly Art with like a weird mixtape thing that we made.
Past and present Hardly Art employees.
Yeah.
It's going to be good.
Wrangled some real weirdos to talk about Hardly Art, including Megan Jasper.
I wouldn't have it
That'll be
any
great.
other way.
Speaking of which, special thanks to the overlords at Sub Pop, Megan Jasper, Jonathan Poneman, and to Chris Jacobs, our boss.
You can find the music at Sub Pop FM. We're going to have show notes, a playlist, all the kind of information you'd want.
Yep. Everything.
Maybe some links to some of the articles we talked about with Joyce.
Yes, including Courtney Love talking about how she wrote doll parts in Joyce's kitchen.
Oh, an article talking about that?
Yeah.
Addresses that?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a quote, man. It's some real legit shit.
Head on over there, subscribe, listen. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Season 3 of the Sub Pop Podcast.
And if you have a question that you want answered, I will try and disappoint you by answering it. So send it our way to podcast@subpop.com.
Mm-hmm.
And find us on Twitter. Anything else? Oh, we didn't have a Megamart ad.
Oh, right.
But
They'll
you can
be there.
buy the music you heard today in the Megamart, which is, what's the URL for the Megamart, Elsa?
Oh, we should have I meant to get Cassidy in here. I still don't know.
Do you
Megamart?
seriously
No,
not know?
megamart.subpop.com.
Google Megamart Sub Pop. It'll get you there. Like, who types in a fucking URL anyway?
I know, and then just expects to be there.
Like, when was the last time you actually typed www? Is that even how URLs work anymore?
I think you can just type in.
What does URL stand for?
Ooh, let's not get into that. Goddamn bomb flushers. They
We
think
own
they're
this
not part
house.
of the problem.